Morning, everybody. How we doing today? It's a Friday here in Minnesota in the upper Midwest in 2021. So I have a question for people, and I want to get your definitions. So please comment below. Let me know what you think. How do you define great? What is greatness? And it's a question that can be many faceted. There's many ways you can look at what greatness is, but it's also, it requires objectivity. It requires some critical thinking and some willingness to not just praise all things. Across the jazz landscape in the 50s and 60s, everybody who recorded could play. I've said it many times before. You didn't get a recording contract in 1956 at any label of any size without having real skill and chops. And there was a lot more real musicians in those days. Most homes had pianos. Music programs in schools were far more in-depth, if they even exist at all anymore. So many people had some musical acumen, and a lot became very talented musicians. And so across the board, black, white, whatever you have, there was a lot of very talented people recording on all the labels, from Argo and Embassy Chicago to the great West Coast labels to all the New York labels. There's not a long list of examples of records of, gee, these guys can't play at all. So the ability to play, the ability to solo, the ability to improvise, the ability to understand the numbers, the math, the freedom to have fun with a melody, it's pretty omnipresent. And so saying such and such or so and so is a great player, or this album is just great, saying they're a good player is kind of a given. You're not really saying much if that's what you're saying. Oh, this guy can really play. So could just about everybody else. I would have a hard time thinking of a list of 5 records out of my 5,000 plus jazz records of, man, these guys can't play. You know, I struggle to think of more than a couple where I'm like, this guy, and even some of those you listen to and find a new appreciation for. There was some who thought Monk couldn't play early in Monk's career, and now that stuff has some highly acclaimed credit attached to it. So ability playing, greatness isn't necessarily really a consideration of that. I find for myself that my objectivity, my definition of what great is, didn't really start having any meaning or purpose until that first time I spent $40 on a record and put it on one day. And I could have bought it years ago and all said, oh, this is great, this is brilliant. But you get enough records, spend enough money, that you're actually willing one day to put a record on and go, you know what, this sucks. I don't like this. And I think until you're willing to be that objective with your own collection and to compromise your own bias towards what you've purchased, your ego says, oh, I spent money on this, it has to be good. And for years, me included, everything we bought was like, oh, this is great, I love it. This is great, I love it. This is great. It was just like a standard definition of why I bought it. It has to be good. It's kind of how many of us justify our connection to the music we buy. But I think until we really say, you know, I spent a lot of money on this record, but actually, I don't like it. And I think that's one of the things that also needs to be clarified, is the difference between what I love, what I like, and what's great. Just because you love something doesn't necessarily make it great. I love a lot of Grateful Dead. And they're good songwriters. They're not great songwriters. And live, they're one of the most fun phenomenon. But greatness is how much I enjoy them. There's a lot of examples in rock and roll, I think, where I've come back to and been like, this isn't quite as great as I remembered it. And there's also some examples that the critics panned, or it took a while, it didn't really sell like people thought it was going to, and they've stood the test of time for various reasons, like Neil Young's Tonight's the Night. It's a stark, ghastly record about two of his friends who OD'd recently, and the perils of life on the road, and drugs and alcohol, and he's fucked up most of the time. You can hear it in his voice. It's bleak stuff, and it got panned when it came out, and no one paid it much mind. But it slowly crept into the landscape because of its integrity, because of its pain, because of its struggle, as one of his great records. The Rolling Stones' Exile on Main Street, which we talked about not that long ago, it never sold that well. It doesn't have a lot of the hits that a lot of their records have. You know, Tumbling Dice and Happy are minor Stones hits for their career, yet that's one of the greatest records of all time. And so I think on some level, hunger, integrity are very important elements in determining what makes a record great. I think Guns N' Roses' first record, Appetite for Destruction, it's raw, it's dirty, it's ugly, it's even uncomfortable. Lyrically, it's edged on inappropriate frequently, and probably wouldn't even be allowed to be made today in some circles. But there was a hunger and a desperation, and we're on our last $2 here. We got to make this work. That they can't recapture in any way on Use Your Illusions. Those are Elton John records. November Rain, come on. So hunger, desperation, struggle, integrity, sincerity, I think those are very important measuring sticks of a musician and an artist's landscape, and their purpose and the vitality and what they're trying to get across. And ultimately, it's the reflection of what it makes you feel. And I think for me, as I've moved forward and collected the main body of work of the jazz canon from the 50s and the mid-60s, it has come down to that. All these cats can play. But what does this cat make me feel? What does that cat make me feel? And speaking of what cats make me feel, I have a cat right there trying to climb into my picture. What does that cat make me feel? Crazy. Because that cat does whatever she wants, whenever she wants, and whatever gets knocked off on her way shouldn't have been there in the first place. Her superiority complex to me, the lowly human, is really quite impressive. And she's half a female lion. Aren't you, Daisy? She's just a beast. She's absolutely a tiger. Good-natured tiger, thankfully. But still, she decides to come in and gnaw on your knuckle in the morning and decides you're going to get up. You're not sleeping any longer. She's pretty persuasive that it's time for the human to get up and defeat the furry cat, the furry creatures. But, so again, what defines great for you guys? What makes a record great? The critics said so? I find when I do some research on many critics, especially today, their knowledge base isn't big enough to really be making some of the opinions some of them are standing on. A lot of times opinions are just regurgitations of earlier opinions and record reviews and liner notes, and there's a lot of repetition in that industry and often not a lot of fresh takes. Let me look at this with clean ears now. Let me hear what this is saying to me now. And so I think the experts, quote unquote, aren't always necessarily a great measuring stick of what's great either. But I definitely don't think it's just, oh, I like this, it's great. And I think that's where we get a lot of confusion in jazz. Because there's so many different camps, there's so many different sounds, there's so many different people who love jazz for different reasons, that we get a lot of, oh, this is one of the greatest records of all time. And it's just kind of, it lacks an objectivity. You know, there's only a handful of records each year in jazz that are really canonical in terms of greatest records of all time. And there's a lot of great records in jazz, but greatest records of all time, that's a big, you know, a lot of jazz was shuck and jive, street talk. We just sit here hustling and jiving, talking some bullshit. See the size of that girl's booty last night? Damn. Juice in that berry was humming. Like, that's the real essence of what a Ben Webster's saying to a Coleman Hawkins. You know, it's about that love and that chase and that the gush, the good. And that's part of its joy. That's part of its sense of expression, you know, and that sexuality is something that kind of is a balm and covers up the desperation and some of the hurt and ugly, but it's really tough, I think, to define great. And so I'm just curious, you guys, in the comments, let me know what makes a great record for you. And I'm going to challenge most people that think carefully before you respond, because what's going to set that record apart? What makes it great? And if you're just saying, well, the soloing on it was fan, that's almost all jazz records have some great soloing. You know, they just do. They're great players. That's why they're doing it. You know, jazz was a very fun place for a musician to go. Even if you weren't a jazz musician, to master that ability of knowing the chord changes and having the freedom to create melody on top of them in your own reforming of it as you go forward via your inspiration and your emotional state, it's a fun thing to do. Any musician would love to take a song they know really well and then just play with it, twist it and contort it and make it their own based on how I feel right now. And that's all jazz was doing. That's all Armstrong ever did, was just like, I feel like this right now, and here's my rendition of this song right now. It's like a lifetime experiences of Dear Diary, June 23rd, 17 of July. I feel this way right now, and I'm going to kind of come across it on this song to try to let y'all know where I'm at. It's a fun form. A lot of musicians love transitioning into jazz. A lot of them weren't even lifelong jazz players. A lot of musicians dabbled in it. You know, even some of the great European players have a kind of a duality where they kind of have more classical stuff and more jazzier stuff. A guy like Andre Previn kind of straddles that line on a consistent basis for me. So I don't think just saying, I love this record, I bought it, I own it, I know it, that makes it great. It's really a very big foundation to stand on. That's just me. Next thing I want to talk about real quick is some of the jazz remix projects that have happened over the last 20 years. Some of which I'm actually a big fan of. I'm only going to play a second of this because it's going to get taken down. But that's Astro Gilberto being remixed here. Who Needs Forever? I think it's Steve Recorp doing this remix. I've played that at my gigs for 20 years. We're playing that, and that's from this Verve Remix 1, which is a really solid 2 LP compilation of remixes from the Verve canon. So it ends up being a triple vinyl set, and it's not all actually Verve artists, which I think is kind of a little bit confusing. But it's because Verve, Universal, whatever it is, has bought up some of these other labels. Is how you get stuff like Nina Simone on here, Sarah Vaughan, Tony Scott. Well, Dinah Washington wasn't really a Verve artist. Carter McRae wasn't really a Verve artist. So they're accessing other parts of the jazz canon from that era that now is under this umbrella and making it all Verve, which was a little bit confusing to me 20 years ago when I was kind of a jazz novice still, looking for Carmen McRae's Verve stuff, looking for the Verve stuff of Nina Simone. I'm like, where's her Verve records? But then you realize it's just it's a corporate thing. But some of these remixes are really fun. They're not jazz in any way. There's no improvisation. There's no swing in that sense. It's a modern beat with a nice bass low end that sounds good in the club that you can lounge to, with some sampled high and mids from the jazz records. And they're fun. I love them. But they're not jazz records. And they're really stripped bare of a lot of the feel. You know, that's what gets lost in translation a lot. But that Verve series had, I think, 4 volumes that I know of. And each one kind of diminishes a little bit in how solid it is across the board. I think that's volume 4 right there, remix 4. Cool covers. Each one has a couple of great songs that I really like. Some of those tracks are a little bit more broken beat, lacking melodic sense. So it could just be kind of a little jangy sample that they kind of put a beat under, and Like, I need a little pocket, a little melody, a little hook. If it's just 4 bars repeating it's not enough for me, you know. But there's some really good stuff on them. Blue Note also dabbles. This is Blue Note revisited, and these are remixed. The Grant Green remix on here is one of my favorites. Oz Lady by Grant Green, Time to Remember. Oz Lady remixes that. That's a really nice track. There's a few other tracks here that are pretty solid. Oriental Folk Song by Wayne Shorter. La Malanga by Kenny Dope by Bobby Hutcherson. There's some other good tracks on this. And again, the remix kind of an electronic, loungy sense. Again, it's part of that misconception of what jazz is. So many things get the word jazz stamped on them. And so we come into jazz with this much broader sense of what defines jazz than what actually defines jazz. I think the deeper I get into jazz, the more jazz I collect, the more narrow the scope becomes of what jazz is. And I think that's another thing, that's one of the tricks of this thing, is there's so many things that have jazz elements that we want to say, oh, that's jazz. Steely Dan's jazz. Tom Waits is jazz. Sketches of Spain is jazz. Avant-garde is jazz. We want to include all these things into the fold that I think borrow from jazz, have adaptations from jazz, but there's something that's not quite what the essence of jazz is. That sexual, swinging, grooving feel and inspiration and the act of emoting my immediate experience through improvisation. That's such an integral part of what jazz is. A lot of its joy, a lot of its feeling, a lot of its expression comes from me sitting back and just trying to open my heart and my ears to, oh, this is Lockjaw Davis. What's he telling me today? Sounds like he had a good night last night. Oh, he sounds a little bit hard up. Times have been dry. It's been tough. Like, you get these feelings from cats from their playing, also based off what you know about their personality. And of course, the brushstrokes I've talked about many times, the brushstrokes of environments that you're born into, your experience in that environment, and your personality, which dictates how you handle your experience in that environment. If I know something about those 3 brushstrokes about a player, I know something about what he's telling me every time he picks up his horn. Because he's coloring and shading from that place. And then you can add some even further layers by knowing what was he doing recently. Was he going through a divorce? Did his father or mother just pass away? Does he have a drug addiction? Was he just coming out of jail? There's other things you can add into that information packet to be able to further contemplate and empathize with what this jazz player must be saying to me. And that's where a lot of the white jazz comes up short. I listen to some guy from California, and he's talking about a convertible and a beach and a beautiful day, and boy, that guy can play. But there's something really light, effervescent, and not medicating. It's not the same essence of a dark Blue Note record where a guy's just bearing his soul, screaming at the universe, going, why, creator? Why do I gotta struggle? Why do my people struggle for so long? It does feel very different. And there's West Coast stuff that plays at blistering tempos and some of those Bethlehem 10 inches. And then there's Blue Note stuff from the hard period that's straight up hard bop. That tempo-wise sound fairly similar. But contextually and even emotionally, when you sit back and listen to it, there's an urgency and a tactful density to what a Wayne Shorter, what a Lee Morgan, what a Hank Mobley is saying. That even a guy that I love as much as Charlie Mariano, he's having a little bit more fun with it. There's a little more joy, a little bit less. It's not less sincere, but it's less serious. It's more, let me show these cats what I can do. Throw some spin on that. Let me play that backwards now. Mariano's having fun. And obviously the guy has some real DNA of struggle as well, because Mariano gets pretty deep in places. But there's just in general, I can hear some West Coast stuff that just cooks. But in my head, I can know pretty quickly, like, those are white cats, you know, they're playing their asses off. Sometimes playing better than the black cats can even play, on better equipment with better horns and better studios. Yet, there's an urgency, a desperation. And so, these jazz remix projects are fun, and they serve a purpose. You know, and they're great to drop on my jazz sets. And for the most part, I've enjoyed playing them, and they will draw some people deeper into the web of jazz. But it's again, it definitely, in some people's minds, confuses them as to what jazz is. The record I got recently is another Illinois Jack Cat record. I wanted to show this. It's an old trumpet player, Verve, 8086. So it's from the first series. I don't think it's a first pressing, but it is a trumpet player logo. It could be a first pressing. That definitely there is not. But again, Jack Cat's one of those guys that deserves a lot more discussed about him than gets discussed on the vinyl community. He's such a great, fierce player with this great, thick tone that it just warms you. You know, it just warms you, and it gets the juices flowing. He's a narrator. He's a storyteller. He's a architect in a lot of ways, because not only was he a real founding father of the Texas tenor sound, and a lot of guys who kind of followed in that ilk, he's also a real innovator in the broader sense of jazz, and is one of the real founding fathers of the tenor sound. When you think about Coleman Hawkins and Ben Webster, and then you think about that next generation of Dexter Gordons, Sonny Rollins, and John Coltrane's, Illinois Jack Cat is a bridge between. You know, Earl Bostic was the R&B side of things. You know, and I like Earl Bostic, he's fun. But when you listen to Illinois Jack Cat, he's got that soulful blues that no matter how hard he's swinging, whether he's playing the blues or not, there's always a blues coming out of Illinois Jack Cat's horn. And he's got that lyrical sense of Hawkins. Sometimes he has the airy breathiness of Ben Webster. But he also has some of the integrity and desperation of a Dexter Gordon. Some of that fiery vivacity and clear ideation. And we all know that Gordon was a direct link to Rollins and Coltrane. So in the lineage of the great tenor players, Illinois Jack Cat ranks highly. And I did a series on the great sax players last summer, about a year ago now. And I ended up covering about 160 sax players that had records as a leader in my collection. And mostly 50s and 60s, obviously. And Jack Cat was someone who just rose and rose in the ranks. The more research I did, the more records, the more biographies I skimmed of artists, the more people I realized, man, these people really respect, love, and were influenced by Illinois Jack Cat. And so he's someone whose records are out there. Again, Verve reissued a lot of their stuff. Some of it was on Clef or Norgran first. And so you can find these records sometimes with different covers, but there's multiple pressings out there, and they come in a pretty wide range of costs. But you can get a lot of Jack Cat's records for $20, $30. Original pressings will go for around $100. And there's a modernity here that I think a lot of people who are collecting are scared to go back to the early 50s. But there's certain players who already embody the modern sound and the modern ideation before those sounds really come to the fore. And Illinois Jack Cat is kind of one of those great early quartet, small group provocateurs. He's really a fantastic agent of this new sound. And he never really went too far out or too far into the bebop thing. He stays kind of in the swing blues sound, the narration of storytelling. Illinois Jack Cat's a guy you got to have more of in your collection. Another fun record I just got recently, and I've already had the Savoy reissue of it, which I'm going to grab. So I've had this 1957 recording by Blakey issued on Savoy probably in 59 or 60, 12/171. I've had this version of it for quite a while, but I knew it wasn't the original pressing, the original cover. I wanted to find an original eventually, and I found a couple Elektra jazz records recently, which I talked about on the channel, and fucking wind. That of course led me to saying, okay, I have a couple Elektras, now I want to get that Blakey Elektra. And Elektra is a record label that most of us are going to know from the 80s, from the Doors in the 70s and 60s, but Elektra goes back to the 50s, and there's not a lot of jazz on Elektra. We talked about, what record was it? that Teddy Charles record recently. Fantastic vibraphone player, West Coast Sound. He has a great electric vibrations or something like that. Really cool cover. But this was one I always kind of knew about. And I was like kind of an oddball to be like, why is there this one record on Elektra Records? I wasn't even sure it was the same Elektra initially. But this is it. You know, and it's a really cool cover. Cooler than the Savoy reissue cover. And this is that second great Jazz Messenger lineup. And the Messenger lineup changes a lot all the time. There's a couple of year periods where they'll have the same group. You know, that great Shorter, Morgan, Jamie Merritt, Blakey. That was a great group for quite a while. Bobby Timmons. You know, the first group was put together for a number of years. There's a Horace Silver version. Then Silver moves on. Mobley moves on. This is that second great group, though, with the great Bill Hardman on trumpet, who's a really kind of under-the-radar guy with some great records. Not a lot, but they're great. Jackie McLean, who is kind of bright and attacking, full of vigor here. And then, of course, the great Spanky DeBrest on the bass, who I get confused sometimes with the piano player, Sam Dockery. Sam Dockery is the piano player, and I can't remember which one's which in my head sometimes. Dockery DeBrest, and I got to remember Sam Dockery, the Docklands, the piano look like docks. That's how I'm trying to remember that Sam Dockery's a piano player. But there's Blakey with his Fire, the great group behind him, the great cover on the great little Elektra label, a fun find. And it really kind of completes my early days of the Blakey Messenger groups. I have pretty much everything now up until about 65 or so, and there's a few releases in that era, the mid-60s, late 60s, that I'm missing. And of course they make records in the 70s and 80s. As most of you know, I don't collect a lot of jazz from that era. The next record I want to talk to you about is this Elmo Hope record. It's a record that Contemporary bought licensed from Hi-Fi Jazz and reissues. But this is the original pressing on the Hi-Fi label out of LA. And Elmo Hope's a great player, a New York piano player with a lot of interesting ins and outs, some elements of Monk. If you like Herbie Nichols, if you like Monk, if you like Bud Powell, Elmo Hope's going to give you strands of all those guys. I just dig Elmo. He spent a lot of time in jail, and I believe it was for drug issues. But Elmo's a guy that deserves a lot more recognition than he gets. His records on Prestige are fantastic. The Blue Note 10-inch stuff is great. That Informal Jazz on Prestige, which became 2 tenors later on, is an absolute classic. And that first album cover for that's outstanding. But Elmo Hope's a great player. I finally got this with the original cover, original design. I've had the Contemporary repressing of that for a while, but I always kind of wanted this one, and a friend of mine had it, and he offered it to me for a really great price. And so I'm happy to add this Elmo Hope now to my collection and to my knowledge of the Hi-Fi label. And the Hi-Fi label is a little label out of Los Angeles that does a couple really, really important jazz records. The Harold Land Fox record, this record here by Elmo Hope. There's a number of other really great jazz records. But they also did Arthur Lyman, the vibraphonist, who does those Hawaii, Bahia, Taboo, all those kind of. Martin Denny was doing Exotica at Liberty, and he's doing the stuff, Arthur Lyman, at Hi-Fi across town. And they used to be bandmates together, Lyman and Denny. And so they're fun, kind of loungy, Exotica, pineapple skirt dancing, cha-cha-cha. And Hi-Fi, the label starts going that direction. You know, they get to a point where most of their releases in the late 50s was Arthur Lyman and stuff of that style. So they stopped kind of recording real jazz. And somehow Contemporary gets those 2 records from Hi-Fi and reissues them, thankfully, because they deserve to have good distribution. But I always wanted to have the original Hi-Fi, and now I do. Last thing I want to show you real quick is a Blue Note artist that gets really kind of overlooked a lot. Is the great J.R. Monteros. Fantastic player. He's one of the last white cats to record a record at Blue Note during the classic era. And that tells you had to be a pretty badass player for Alfred to be like, I'm not really recording white cats right now, but you got it. You know, you got it. He also has a great record on the Jaro label. This is a pretty tough record to come by on a very small label. In Action, I think it's called, Studio 4. Pretty anonymous group. J.R. Monteros is the biggest name in this group. I've been looking for this for a long time. and this kind of dropped in my lap as well recently. Another great hard bop, essential record of this era. You know, it's such a fantastic time for jazz. It's just bubbling over with ideas and innovations and changes. And lastly, to go full circle with this episode, the one ingredient of greatness that we didn't really discuss is innovation. And innovation is the most tricky element to diagnose. What is innovation worth? How important is it? And how successful is that innovation in the listener's ear, in the commercial sense? How much does it have to be registered by the public for the innovation to be considered an important innovation? And that's one of the measuring sticks, I think. You know, the Beatles' innovations were always landmark because no matter what they innovated, they were still very successful doing it. And I think that's a key element. If you're going to do psychedelic, but you're still going to make it wonderful, you're going to promote that innovation. That's going to make other people curious about that innovation and buy other psychedelic records. Sadly, few of the other psychedelic records really rose to the level of what George Martin and the Beatles were able to do. You know, the Beatles stand pretty alone, but the innovations, when it comes to the Beatles, there's a long list of stuff the Beatles innovated. And that's one of the other things too, is that when you have the limelight, you do often, like a Miles Davis, get credit for innovations that you didn't really innovate, but you brought to the public's eye. And the Beatles probably are guilty of that at times too, where they're getting credit for something that they did first as a major artist, but maybe they weren't always the first one to do things. They were hearing Brian Wilson, the Beach Boys, they were hearing Frank Zappa, the Mothers of Invention, they were hearing Bobby Dylan. So the Beatles were borrowing from others as well. But there's no question, we listen to Tomorrow Never Knows, that driving, pulsing, almost drum and bass, club, remix, hammering groove that just is a loop, that just loops and loops and loops. That was pretty innovative for 1966. There was nothing that really sounded like that. Yet you can find a lot of stuff like that today in the electronic scene. Revolution number 9 was pretty innovative. Helter Skelter. Ozzy Osbourne said, as a kid, it was like, that's it. I want to rock. I want to roll. I want to go down that path. So innovation isn't good enough on its own steam. Innovation has to be successful. It has to have some measure of, it doesn't necessarily have to be commercial, but it has to be accepted by its audience and appreciated and have impact on other aspects of the scene. And that's the tricky part about innovation. You can't just innovate for the sake of innovating. You have to make it work. It has to become essential at that point. It's so much of the pop rock scene. A lot of times innovation was simply a change of look. And there's changes throughout the history of rock where entire new genres kind of pop out. And the biggest innovation was, we're not changing how we write songs or what instruments we use or how we approach recording. We're simply going to look different. We're going to not wear disco clothes anymore, or we're going to start wearing disco clothes. You know, some of those funk bands in the 80s, some of the outfits they wore, it was like they took the disco era and then cut a bunch of the frill off and left it with a G-string, a diaper, and a nipple tassel. If you look at some of the outfits the guys like Cameo wore, Midnight Star, some of those bands had some funny gear on, man. Prince, NPG, those guys wore some funny outfits. You know, the time, Prince the Revolution, a lot of those records, those guys were wearing funny gear. You know, and clothing too often is conceived as a new thing or a new sound in music. And clothing, fashion, style, image shouldn't be given as much license, or as we shouldn't be as willing to adapt to it, saying that's change or innovation because they look different. Even Nirvana wasn't really that different. It's alt garage rock. We've heard that before. Neil Young and Crazy Horse do a lot of things that Nirvana weren't inventing. Pearl Jam wasn't inventing. You know, alt garage, alternative, grunge, That stuff has been out there for a long time. So, image, not really the determination of greatness. Innovation is a very finite measuring stick. Commercial appeal, the critics, a lot of it's just ability to play. A lot of things don't define greatness. Even sales don't necessarily define greatness. You know, a lot of bad records sell a lot of copies. And so great for me is integrity and feeling, and what is the artist channeling and where is it taking my mind and my soul. You know, when John Lennon's crying about mother, you had me but I never had you. When Bob Dylan's crying about it's all right mom, only bleeding. You know, when Neil Young's bleeding about tonight's the night. Bruce Berry was a working man, used to load that Econoline van. When you feel that struggle, the Stones on Exile on Main Street, when you feel that ache, that desperation, Eric Clapton on Tears in Heaven, it's a campy ass Candle in the Wind kind of song in some levels, but because of his pain, having lost his son, if I recall, there's something about pain that makes art special. And all you have to do is look at the Bible and its longevity to recognize that a pained people can find a voice through that pain that will resonate for centuries, for millennia. And so I think on one of the greatest, most important levels of greatness, it definitely is what does it make me feel. And that's where I think the audiophile people are missing out. They listen to a lot of great music on their speakers and their sound systems and hear their speakers, but they're missing that component of what's it making you feel, because they're not listening to the art. They're listening to the ink on the paper, the book binding, the printing, the cover, the font. They're talking about all the exterior factors of the book and not the story itself. And I've said many times, if you're in a Tom Sawyer book club and you're sitting around talking about the book binding and the ink, you might be missing something, because the story is the point. It's a great story. Can we talk about Huck? Can we get to Jim? I'd like to talk about that. But you're still talking about the ink, the paper, the book binding. It gets really exhausting. And so when it comes down to it, each person's going to have their own interpretation of greatness. What's yours? Check me out on Patreon. You want to support the channel, $5 a month, whatever. It's always appreciated. Again, if you want some great merchandise, go to the merchandise store in the description below. Some great t-shirts, hoodies, other stuff as well, sweatpants. I got some new gear coming on the line as well, working on the coffee shop, the Jazz Shepherd Coffee Shop. It's going to be a fun thing. There's still a lot of work to be done, but it's coming together. So y'all be safe, be blessed. God love in my heart for all y'all. Let's be strong together. Peace. We'll talk to you soon.